Hello, hello, and welcome to Get the Most from Your Big Garden Birdwatch. I'm Jamie. First of all, a few bits of Zoom housekeeping. As this is a Zoom webinar, you won't be able to turn on your video or your microphone, but you can ask us questions using the Q&A box, and we'll do our very best to answer them while we're here. Now, we have time allocated for Q&A at the end of the session, but we might drop in a few questions midway through. If you've got any burning questions, think of them now, start popping them in the Q&A box. There's no chat function enabled for this event. If you have any technical issues, there is someone available from the events team to help out if they can, but for very specific Zoom issues, they might not be able to assist. So, Big Garden Birdwatch, starting this Friday, 26th of January, and running until Sunday, the 28th of January. We are in our 45th year. Really, really exciting. Lots going on and lots to do. In this session, which lasts about an hour, we'll be hearing about the fascinating history of the Big Garden Birdwatch. I'm going to welcome Peter Holden. Hello, Peter, who founded Big Garden Birdwatch in 1979.
Hi,
Hello.
Jamie. Hi,
Hello.
Jamie.
We're going to come back to Peter in a moment. I'm also going to welcome photographer Ben Andrew, who's going to be talking to us about the secrets of garden bird photography. Hello, Ben. Welcome, Ben.
Hi,
And
Jamie.
also, hello. And also Molly Brown from our wildlife team is joining us to give us some bird ID tips. Hello, Molly.
Hello, everyone.
Now, Molly will be looking at the birds in the sort of top 20. Last week in our last session, we looked at the top 10. So we're going to be moving on to other birds that are likely, perhaps less likely, but likely to come into the garden. And we've got a few special ones as well that we always wish would turn up in our garden. So we'll talk about those in a little bit. I'd like to thank everyone for joining to start with, because you're all members, you're all RSPB members, which is wonderful. And without your support, we couldn't do half of the things we do. So, well, I mean, the things we do indeed. So thank you for that. And thank you for joining us today. Let's go to Peter first of all, because Peter, I just think, I mean, I don't know about you, but when I grew up in the 80s and 90s, I was a member of the Young Ornithologist Club. And Peter was the head of the YOC. I should have brought my badge. There was a little kestrel badge that I used to wear with great pride.
Make
And
me feel
Peter's
very
name,
old. Very old.
no, not at all, not at all. And Peter's name was always at the front of BirdLife magazine. So tell us a bit about the YOC, Peter.
Oh, the YOC. I mean, it was, and it still is there. Of course, it's not gone. It's just turned into, it's gone into wildlife explorers now. And it's grown even bigger. But yes, it was a tiny club that grew out of something that started during the war, the Junior Bird Recorders Club. And I went to the lodge as an enthusiastic sort of late teenager, missed out on university, and in 1969 had this little group of young people who were interested in birds. And I spent the first part of my career sort of developing that and getting more boys and girls out bird watching and finding adults who enthused them. And it was a very personal experience, I think. People who went through that period really engaged with it, felt very personally engaged. They knew the individuals. They often had local leaders in their local town, and so it had a face. And it's lovely to know that it obviously grew. It grew very large and got more and more exposure. And it's great now, as I now talk to local RSPB members groups around the country, I come across older adults who say, I remember you when I was 15. And I say, I don't remember you very well. But anyway, but yes, it's great to know that they're still there, or a lot of them are still there, and interested in birds and wildlife, because it doesn't just stop with birds. It goes on to wildlife and general conservation, of course.
So YOC has this incredible legacy, doesn't it? It's absolutely brilliant. But I think one of the key things I think we're going to be talking about today is what started 10 years later. So 1979, the seed was sown, wasn't it, for Big Garden Birdwatch? Tell us, how did that all start?
Even a year earlier than that, because the big challenge of running the YOC was that we had to engage children, we had to involve them, and we had to come up with ideas that were topical, that were educational, and ideally they could write in and send in the results, so we could actually judge how popular our activities were, and if possible, scientific, that we were learning something, and certainly the children taking part were learning something. So 1978, casting my mind around for something to do in January, thinking, what on earth could that be? What happened if all the children looked out of their windows at exactly the same time and counted the birds in the garden, sent in their results, and we could do a top 10 garden birds in Britain. How about that? And that seemed like quite a good idea. So we tried it. Of course, it was false. I got it wrong in year one. All the children all over the country, all at the same time. I chose between 8 and 9 in the morning, which was a good time for birds at Sandy in Bedfordshire, where I was, but not a few in Shetland because it hadn't got light. So we had a few complaints about that, which meant we had to do it again. But it was popular. And even in year one, I was sort of an unofficial advisor to Blue Peter in those days. I used to turn up in their garden and do things with yogurt pots. And the famous Biddy Baxter used to sort of say, come on and do something about birds in winter. And I had the rare privilege of being able to ring her up with ideas. And she'd usually say, rubbish, or very curtly, no, I don't want to do that. And just occasionally say, well, we'll make a program idea. And she said, yes, this idea of counting the birds, top 10 garden birds, we could do that on the program as long as you can have the results ready by next Tuesday. Which, no pressure there then. And we did it, and it was huge. And we got 34,000 children engaged in the first year. It would only been a few hundred if it had been YOC, but because Blue Peter involved, BBC One in those days, not much opposition to that at all. Families sitting down in the evening to watch the program. It was a really good family thing. So yeah, even from year one, it became very big. And so we had to do it again and again and again.
And it grew and grew and grew. Now, Peter, just thinking back to the first results that you got by working with Blue
Yeah.
Peter. So now, but certainly the last few years that I can remember, the house sparrow has always been number one. Was that the case at the beginning?
We put our money on, if we actually thought about it, was house sparrow. We assumed house sparrow won, starling a second. And it was the other way around. Interestingly, and I think it's worth sort of looking at the ornithology, the conservation of that, because in those days, in the 1970s, you did get flocks of starlings. People fed scraps into their garden. That was seemed to be the way you fed, most people fed their birds. And if you put scraps out in your garden, if you got starlings, you got a flock of starlings, or usually, and the average, I'm just recalling from memory, but I think the average across the country was an average of 15 starlings per garden in year one. And it was about an average of 10 house sparrows per garden. So both numbers are much bigger. But of course, those big flocks of starlings, I mean, they're not gone completely, but they're not what they were. And they've dwindled down. I think the average these days is about 3 or 4 starlings per garden. And of course, a lot of gardens don't get them at all.
Yeah, big changes over the years. Song thrush, we'll touch on it as well later on, but song thrush was in the top 10, wasn't it, to begin with?
Yeah, it was number 10. Yeah, there was half a song thrush in each garden. I mean, it was 0.5 or 0.6 of a song thrush. But I mean, across the country, because we had to do it on averages, I mean, that's how you did it. And that's how I got the sample back to Biddy Baxter to meet the program, is I just had the number of gardens, number of birds, and divided one into the other. And that's the methodology that's still used today. It's very simple, but it means that you end up with half a song thrush per garden. But it's nothing like that now.
No, it's all changed.
Much
Now,
better.
there have been some surprises over the years, haven't there? What are the strangest observations and the weirdest things that have turned up that you've
Well,
heard about?
I'm going to go back to the first year. I mean, there were lots. Every year produces surprises. I think probably the funniest one right back at the beginning was Biddy Baxter, of course, taking an interest in this in the program. And we got this. What's the unusual bird? What unusual birds got? Well, I said, I've got a gannet here in Leicester. Oh, we'll have that on the program. Well, I was very, very worried about gannet. I mean, I suppose it could have been. You can never say never, but as a garden bird, I mean, it had to go on the program. Biddy came from Leicester, and if there was something to do with Leicester, it was going to be on the program. And so I'm afraid in year one, it went on slightly against my better judgment. We'll never know whether it was or wasn't. But of course, over the years, the recordings got better. Often there are adults in the background helping children with these days, because it's a lot of adults taking part anyway. But in the other days, it was adults, families working together, and unusual birds would be spotted. We always got excited by blackcaps. In the early days, blackcaps weren't that common in gardens. They're not that common now, but there's certainly more of them wintering in Britain. At first, we thought they were marsh tits and wrongly identified. And of course, they've changed their migratory habits, and they're turning up in British Garden. And then there have been things like little bunting. There have been some years when there have been waxwings, of course, around, yellow-browed warblers, again. And you think, oh, well, were they Goldcrests? But very often there have been adults who've come in and verified the identification. And so, yes, we found some interesting stuff. And you do. I found my first blackcap in the garden was during a big garden birdwatch, simply because I sat down and watched for an hour. And I don't quite honestly do that very often. And you spot things you wouldn't otherwise spot.
It's a really good point, because even as a keen birder, I would never, as you know, of a normal weekend, I would never sit down by the window and go, "Right, I'm going to stare. I'm going to fix myself at the window, look out for an hour." But you just don't, do you? But it's amazing what you can see within that time and what happens. I discovered we have blue tip visits in the garden during big garden birdwatches, which I'd never seen just glancing out of the window. Um, yeah, I mean, what do you think Big Gun Birdwatch's legacy is? I mean, what's it? Obviously, we talked a bit about the YOC's legacy, but what's it? What's it kind of? It's now kind of cemented in society, isn't it? It's this wonderful kind of tradition that people go back to.
Yes, I mean, I feel that's a great privilege that to be associated with something that has gone on and on. Of course, it was always children in the early days, and it wasn't. It was about 10 years before the RSPB sort of decided, oh, these children might be finding something interesting. We better have a look at this as well. And so they started looking at the science of it. And it's still most important of all, a public engagement activity, but there's no doubt it's giving a really good snapshot of the countryside. So there's a legacy there. But I think even in the early days, and what's there now is that although it's started with children, and I hope children still engage, and of course there's big schools birdwatch as well, which has grown out of it. I remember an early producer, assistant to Billy Baxter, said, I better do this stuff on birds. He said, I was quite interested, but I took it home to my children. I suggested that we all watched it when it came out and took part in the government. He said it was fascinating. He said, we're all there as a whole family. We're going to do that again. And I think it's this family engagement that the children can't concentrate very much for an hour mostly, but to have to have parents around supporting them, filling in those times when they're not there, and getting that interest. And all through the YOC, I've discovered this, that children's enthusiasm often enthuses the parents, and they stay with it and encourage it. And that's so important, so nice for a family, of course, but so important for nature conservation.
It really is. Thank you so much, Peter. And please do stick around in case we get any questions in for you.
Well,
that's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much.
thanks,
Now, as I think everyone watching is an RSPB member, do have a look at your magazine, either the print or digital form. And there is a brilliant feature in there by Dominic Cousins, which pulls out lots of interesting facts about some of the birds that may turn up in your garden, some of which we'll touch on a bit later on today. Now, also in your printed magazines, you may see lots of very beautiful photographs of birds. And if you look at the names on some of them, you'll see that many are taken by Ben Andrew, who is our photographer, and also an award-winning photographer, wildlife photographer. And we're very, very lucky to have Ben here to share some tips on garden bird photography today. So I'll just let him load up his slides. These are absolutely beautiful, and even if you don't go out and take photos, I just love looking at Ben's pictures. Ben, over to you.
Thanks, Jamie. Appreciate you having me on. I'm guessing you can see my screen.
Yeah, all good.
Great. Yeah, so hi everyone, my name is Ben. I'm the RSPB's picture researcher, and I look after our photographic library as well. And as Jamie was saying, it's part of Big Garden Birdwatch. Obviously, the main reason for doing it is to count the birds in your garden. That's the main reason. We want everyone to be doing that. But at the same time, there could be an opportunity whilst you're doing Big Garden Birdwatch, or just off the sort of back of doing it, is to think about doing some garden bird photography. So I'm going to give you a few hints and tips and talk a bit about garden bird photography now. As with all photography, it nearly always comes down to light and backgrounds. For me, it's always about light and backgrounds, you know, thinking about the light direction and thinking about your background. So when it comes to garden bird photography, if you're thinking about setting something up in your garden so you can start photographing the birds that are coming in, think about the direction of light. Where are your birds going to be front lit? So where does the sun rise? Where does it set? Sorry, hold on a minute. Yeah, so where does the sun rise and where does the sun set? and where can you see where can you kind of get the best view of your birds in terms of being lit. So that would be my main kind of thing to think about. And then secondly is to think about your backgrounds as well. So think about where you are, where you've got your nicest backgrounds coming. Can I just ask, so I can't share my screen anymore. Something's gone wrong?
Yeah, Ben, just to let you know, we switched over to the events team's view because your screen wasn't loading properly. So
Fine.
our expert events team will listen to your words and I'll carefully click through to the next slides.
I'll just say next slide. That's absolutely fine. So if we can go to the next slide, there we go. Yeah. So first of all, as I was saying, think about where you're going to be, where your birds are going to be front lit. Where's the sun coming from? Do you get the light in your garden in the morning, or do you get it in the afternoon? And then think about your backgrounds. I love a nice sort of clean kind of background, like on this robin photo here, where everything's diffused. It can be quite hard in a garden. It can be quite a narrow, small space. But is there an area of your garden where maybe the fence panels get kind of lit up in the afternoon, and they can provide a nicely lit background? On the next picture, we can see a nuthatch, and this is an example of a bird that's being actually backlit. So the sun's actually coming from behind this bird, but that still produces a really lovely photo. So you don't always have to be front lit, and you might not have a choice. The best light might be in the afternoon, and you might be looking into the sun, and that's fine. You can try and shoot with a backlit bird. Next slide, please. So for me, once you've thought about kind of getting the conditions right, it's then about obviously luring the birds into your garden to photograph them. And obviously one of the best ways is to feed your birds. And so I would always recommend starting by photographing the birds on the feeders. If we go to the next pictures, and we can sort of slowly scroll through, we can see that just photographing the birds on the bird feeders is a great starting point. And obviously you can start becoming more creative with this as well. So not just the birds actually perched on the actual feeder, but on top of the feeder, you can maybe then start shooting through some kind of vegetation in the foreground, have a hint of the garden in the background, like this shed in the background, that kind of thing. So getting the birds on the feeders to start with, it's just good practice, I think. It's just a good way of learning the birds' habits, learning where they're landing, learning about light, learning about your camera settings and things like that. And that's just good practice. It's not the end goal, though. Obviously, you'd rather have a picture where the bird is perched sort of more naturally. So if we go to the next slide, we can see that start thinking about natural perches. So can you put your feeder next to or in a tree, a shrub, a bush, anywhere? Can you put it anywhere where the birds will land first? Birds love kind of, they like perching somewhere before they then land on your bird feeder. Most birds don't fly straight into the feeder. They'll land in a hedgerow, they'll land in a bush, they'll land in a tree first. So is there somewhere where you can get the birds landing first and photographing them in somewhere sort of more natural? Then suddenly you've got your shot, you've got your light, you've got your background, and you've got a more naturalistic photo. You've got no bird feeders in there or anything like that. Some people don't have a tree, a shrub, or a bush or anything like that in their garden at all, and that's totally fine. So the next thing to do would be introducing your own perches. So if you've got a standalone bird feeder just sort of in the middle of your garden or to one side in your garden, and the birds are landing, they're coming into the garden, they're coming straight onto the feeder, what about introducing something next to that bird feeder? So you can put your own perch up. You can clamp a perch next to it. You can pick whatever perches you want. They can be the most beautiful, wonderful, lichen-covered branches you can find. But think about, is there a way of setting up an area a staging area where the birds will land first, and then you can capture them, and then they'll land on the feeder. And the good thing about this is you can move your feeder around. You can move the perches around. So as the day moves on, you could maybe even halfway through the day move your perches around to get different types of light, different kinds of backgrounds and things like that. There is also the option of photographing them on sort of more man-made features in your garden. So my garden's a bit like that. It's a new build garden. I've done everything I can to make it nature friendly, but it hasn't got like a big tree or anything like that in it. So a lot of my bird photography ends up being birds perching on man-made features, on a bench in the garden maybe, or they might be perching on garden, like the shed roof, for example. So all of these photos taken in my garden, you know, on the guttering and on the fences as well, and things like that. So there's still option. Oh yeah, on the satellite dish as well. There's lots of options of man-made features in our gardens where you know, you can photograph them on. And I mean, this photo of the starling, for example, was taken out of a bedroom window because the bedroom is exactly in line with the garage roof. So, you know, you don't have to restrict yourself to being, you know, in your actual garden itself. You could be photographing it outside of a window or something like that. But there's, you know, these photos still make lovely photos, and they have a sense of garden about them. Obviously the next most important way to attract birds into the garden is thinking about water as well. So oh, sorry, I missed a bit out. So garden props. Sorry, there is yeah. If you once you've done all of this, you could start becoming even more creative. So we're still thinking about bird feeders here, but if, you know, rather than putting branches down or anything like that, you could be kind of setting up little props. So these teasels are not naturally growing in a garden. This is just a way of creating kind of a sort of made up shot of birds feeding on teasels in the countryside. But these kind of photos, you know, they're kind of fun. You know, blackbird on your washing line or something like that. They're kind of fun photos that kind of, you know, you can create yourself. You can come up with all kinds of ideas. The classic one, which you don't have a photo of in this presentation, but the classic one is obviously like a robin on a spade handle or something like that. And obviously once it snows, lots of photographers are out there getting their spades into the garden and getting their robins perched on the spade handle. Water. Now, yeah, water is the next kind of obvious way to attract a bird into a garden. So you've got them coming into the feed, but you obviously want to try and get them in for water. So for drinking and for bathing. And again, very similar to the bird feeder photos. Initially, you could just get them coming in, landing on a bird bath and having a drink or having a bath. And that's absolutely fine. You know, again, perfectly good photos, good to practice, and good ways of capturing birds kind of doing this kind of behavior. But as you move on from these sorts of photos, you can then start thinking more photographically. So can you sink a bird bath into the ground a bit more ground level? You can then lay down, you can get flat onto the ground, and you can get something that's a bit more natural, just nicer backgrounds, and then, you know, your eye level with the birds. You've got that kind of splashing behavior. So yeah, if you can do that, brilliant. If you can go one step further, dig a pond, dig somewhere where, you know, where you can even get kind of completely water level, and it looks very natural, then suddenly you can get shots of birds bathing and drinking it looks like they're coming down to a natural puddle or a natural pool. And, you know, I think those kind of eye level kind of photos that look natural are, you know, are really fantastic. So if you've got the room, if you've got the space, try doing that. Next slide, please. So once you've kind of captured these static shots of birds visiting your garden, perching on things and things like that, then it's all about capturing behavior after that. Are you witnessing any behavior in your garden that then you can turn into a photographic project? One of the key behaviors I would say would be squabbling around bird feeders. Lots of birds have arguments on the best places to perch. And these arguments are quite fascinating to watch between different species, sometimes the same species, but they often end up in birds kind of flapping around and kind of fighting mid-air near the bird feeders. So that does allow, if you've got the space to one side, it does allow, and you've got the camera settings and everything right, you can capture these kind of action shots. You know, goldfinches are one of the main birds that seem to do this kind of squabbling mid-air near bird feeders. So it's worth having a look at trying to capture that sort of behavior, and then you can kind of get all kinds of other kind of behaviors in your garden as well, you know, in not necessarily during Big Garden Birdwatch, but, you know, in the summertime you'll get adults and young birds interacting and feeding each other, and obviously, you know, could get this sort of behavior now, but you also get adults kind of behaving with other adults, so birds kind of mutually preening each other, and even going one step further sometimes as well. So both of those pigeon photos in my back garden, very easy to see bird behavior. Once, you know, in your own back garden, you see a lot, you know, especially if you're in a position where you're looking out your window regularly, you'll see these sorts of behaviors. So think about capturing behaviors in your garden if you can. Next slide, please. So as Peter was talking about, there are plenty of rarer visitors to gardens. So once you've kind of got your regular common garden birds visiting, and you've got your ensemble of your regulars that you know about, you will get irregular visitors, and it can depend on different conditions. So if you've got lots of garden birds coming to your garden, you're going to get predatory birds as well. Sparrowhawks are definitely one of the kind of rare, they're a common bird, but a rare visitor to a garden, even rarer to be able to capture one on camera. But every now and then you might get lucky with something like a sparrowhawk. And then after that, there are some birds that would not normally visit a garden, but maybe during cold snaps and colder months they do. So I get a regular pied wagtail, kind of hoovering up kind of seeds and things like that on my patio. Black redstart is often a species that kind of get reported into gardens in the wintertime. They can come to your food as well. And these are black redstarts that have been visiting a garden near to me a few years ago. So a rare visitor to our gardens, but once they're in there, they're quite regular. And obviously this year it's very it might be, the chances are higher than normal of a waxwing visiting your garden. So keep an eye out for those. Blackcaps, as well, as Peter said, blackcaps can visit gardens as well. So it's a good opportunity to look for rare visitors. Next slide, please. So just a final few tips really on what you can do to kind of increase your chances of getting those shots. I would say staying hidden is definitely a good idea. You don't want to be standing out in the middle of your garden without some sort of maybe hide or something like that, if you can get a hide into your garden. Some birds may be so tame that they don't mind you just standing there, but it's always good to start thinking about working from a hide or something like that. But it doesn't have to be, you don't have to buy a hide and put it up in your garden. You can hide in different ways. So you could just simply be inside the house, shooting out of your back door, or out of a window, upstairs window or something like that. You could be using your shed, taking a panel out of your shed, or using the shed, shooting out the shed door. Anywhere where you're just slightly hidden and gives you a good viewpoint, a good access into your garden, that I think the birds will think, will instantly become a little bit more accustomed to you. And of course, if you don't have a garden, or you don't have a garden that has many birds coming into it, or it just doesn't have the space to allow for photography, the wider neighborhood, I'll call it, is a good idea. All these photos you're going to see now are all photos that I've taken just around the housing estate that I live in, just from going for a walk and finding kind of hedgerows, bushes and things like that. There's plenty of garden birds and garden bird type photography to be done just from having a walk in your neighborhood and having a look if there's any other places where birds will visit. So, dunnocks, blackbirds, house sparrows, starlings, all these species will visit our kind of wider neighborhood. And we'll give you those opportunities if your garden doesn't allow it itself. So do get out there and try and, even if you've got a local kind of park or something like that, try and find a way of kind of capturing these garden birds as best you can. So that's it for me. Thanks for listening. I really appreciate it. Sorry for the technical problems, but appreciate you, saving the day there, guys. And thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Ben. And if you've got any questions for Ben, please do pop them in the Q&A box and we will try and do our best to answer them a little later on. Thank you, Ben. Now, we looked, as I said, at the top 10 garden birds that you might get in your garden in our last session. Joining us now is Molly. Molly Brown works for our expert wildlife team. They work incredibly hard, responding to many, many emails and phone calls and sharing their knowledge as widely as they can. Now, Molly is going to talk us through the sort of remainder of the top 20, the other birds that you might see in your garden, with some ID tips and some of those special species that Ben and Peter have touched on there. Over to you, Molly.
Thanks, Jamie. So we're going to be talking through some of these common birds that you could be seeing. So we're starting off with the chaffinch. This is something that's probably been quite familiar to a lot of you. It's one of our most abundant ones. The males and the females do look a little bit different, so that is something to look out for. So the males have that kind of blue-grey kind of crown with a pink face and pink breast, whereas the females a little bit more brown. They both will have that black and white marking along the wing that you can see there. So you'll know you've got a chaffinch if you see those kind of markings on the wing. And we've got a lovely video here you can see. So it is quite a familiar sight in gardens. You'll probably see them hopping around under the feeders. They like to be looking around there for fallen seed. And last year, chaffinch was number 11 in our top 10. So you've got a good chance of seeing one of these. And then we've got the dunnock. So dunnock's been mentioned already today. I know Ben had a few photos of them. They do skulk around under the hedges and under vegetation and borders of your garden. So you might see one of these. They are called quite commonly in certain areas of the country. They are still called hedge sparrows, and that's because they look quite similar to house sparrows. So the main way to differentiate them is they're these small brown birds, but they've got a very different beak to a house sparrow. So where you're looking at the dunnock here, you can see it's got a very thin, pointy beak, and that's because the bill has been adapted for feeding on insects, whereas our house sparrows have got that much chunkier beak, which is much better for feeding on seeds. And the dunnock was number 12 in our Big Garden Birdwatch last year. So again, got a good chance of spotting one of these. And then we've got the jackdaw. So the jackdaw is one of our smallest crows. It is quite identifiable when you're looking at a corvid because it's got this quite sheen, like silvery sheen on the back of the head and a very identifiable kind of blue-grey eye. It's fairly common. It is found across gardens quite a lot. And it was number 13 in last year's Big Garden Birdwatch. So you do have a good chance of seeing one of these, one or two. Sometimes they hang around in pairs. And then we've got these feral pigeons. Now, these are probably quite a familiar sight for many of you. They come in all sorts of colours. So you can get very blue ones, black ones, patterns, even some come in a cinnamon brown kind of colour. So they are very, very common. And they were ranked at number 14 last year for our Big Garden Birdwatch. And then we are on to the collared dove. This is another kind of dove pigeon that you might be familiar with. It's very pale, buff brown, that solid colour, but the most easy way to identify them is, as the name suggests, it's collar. So it's got this lovely black ring on the back of the neck, which is the best way to tell what you're looking at. So collared doves are actually quite a new addition, unsurprisingly, although you might be quite used to seeing them. They first nested here only in the 1950s, so it's quite a new addition to the UK. They have spread quite quickly and they are quite common across all gardens. So you have got quite a good chance of seeing one of these as well. They were ranked at number 15 last year for our Big Garden Birdwatch results. And another corvid that you're all probably very familiar with is a carrion crow. So they're all jet black and they're so super clever. They're fairly solitary. They'll either spend time on their own or in pairs. They can sometimes group together and form a flock, but they wander in and out of gardens. They are, like I said, very clever. So they'll try to find a way to get to any food source that they can. And quite closely related to the hooded crow, which is actually only recently split off as a separate species. So I'd keep an eye out for one of these. They were ranked at number 16 last year for our Big Garden Birdwatch. And this lovely little bird is quite shy and it's a coal tit. They look quite similar to great tits, but you've got a couple of key ways to tell them apart. So firstly, they're a lot smaller and you'll be able to see if you have different tits in your garden, you'll be able to tell quite a bit how smaller they are than the great tit. But really you're looking for the muted colours to them. They almost look a bit washed out compared to the great tit. You can also just about see in this picture, they've got a white dot on the back of the head. And one very easy way, the way that I tend to focus on, is the muted colour, but this black bib here is that on the great tit, that black line goes all the way down the breast, down to its belly, whereas the coal tit, it just stays as like a little bib around the neck. So that's probably the best way to tell. You're lucky, you might be able to see one of these. They were ranked at number 17 last year for the Birdwatch. They are quite shy. They tend to fly in really quickly. They grab a bit of food and then they disappear off again. So they like to eat in private or even cache it away, which is quite a special talent of these. They like to hide their food into any nooks and crannies and trees and cracks and crevices, and so they can save their food for a cold day or when they need it most. Now we've got the greenfinch. So as the name suggests, they are quite olivey green. They are lovely birds. They're olivey green in general. That's normally the male. So the females and the juveniles might seem a little less green, a little more brown. But they all should have this wing bar with that real yellow flash on the wings. That's a really key identifier for you. They also have a very chunky beak. That's quite another key thing to be looking for, and that's because they're just well adapted to munching on seeds. And they were number 18 last year for our Big Garden Bird Watch. And then this is another little familiar sight. This is a wren. So this tiny brown bird is really common in gardens, one of our most abundant birds, but it is quite shy and does like to hide away into vegetation, and they nest in ivy, so they're very hidden away normally. They're a super round bird, so like a little ball of fluff, really, with a very fine bill and a very short, narrow tail that seems to stick up. So if you're looking for a very tiny, raw, small ball with the tail and a tiny bill, that's the key thing you're looking for there. They are very common. Like I said, they're one of our most abundant birds. They have declined in recent years, unfortunately. And they were number 19 in our birdwatch last year. And this is our song thrush. So it was mentioned earlier. It is a really very elegant looking bird, and they're quite identifiable because they've got this real brown back with a super spotty chest. So that spotted chest is a real identifier for it. They have some interesting behaviors. So what they like to do is they feed on snails quite a lot of the time, lots of invertebrates and snails, and they like to choose a favorite rock, which will act like an anvil, and they tend to pick up their snails and smash it against the rock, and that's so they can break open the shell and get to the food inside. So it's quite a clever little trick that they've developed. It was very, very common back in the day, like as we mentioned, when RSPB's first ever birdwatch happened in 1979. It was the 10th most common garden bird, but it's declined quite rapidly, unfortunately. So last year, only ranked at number 20. And then we've got another thrush here. We've got the redwing. So these are actually the smallest members of the thrush family that we get in the UK. They tend to visit us over winter, come to our shores over winter. And you might have a chance of spotting them during your bird watch, because they do like to come. January is quite a good time to see them. They are quite a similar shape to the song thrush, but they've got this brown back and a streaked breast, and they've got that very clear eye stripe that you can see there. And they're, as their name suggests, they've got a very red orange patch under the wing. That's what gives their name of a redwing. So you might be lucky and spot one of these. They were ranked at number 34 last year. So some people did see them. They tend to come in looking for berries, especially any kind of fruit trees with little red berries on will be the perfect place to spot them. And then another thrush that we may see is a fieldfare. So this is quite a large thrush instead. They have a very blue-grey hood on them, the grey-brown back and streaked breast with a white rump. They were number 37 in last year's birdwatch. So again, you might be lucky. It would be normally weather dependent. Both fieldfares and redwing, they spend quite a lot of time together. So you might find that you might have a little group of the two coming into the garden. Fieldfares tend to come over in the winter. They come all the way from Scandinavian countries, coming here because it's a bit milder than their winters. And if there's a real cold snap over the weekend, which weather permitting, you might notice that they come into the garden looking for food. So you can try and encourage them by putting some fruit out, like some apples or pears on the floor, and you might be lucky enough to spot some. And then finally, we have these beautiful birds, which are waxwings. So they look very exotic, and they come all the way from the forests of Northeast Europe. And in some winters, which this is one of those winters, where you can get very large numbers that come over to the UK, and they come looking for food, for berries. So these events where we get large numbers in the UK are called eruptions, and they occur when you either have very large populations that have decimated all their food and they need more, or there's just a very poor berry crop where from over in the rest of Europe. So they have to come all the way over here to try and look for food. So if you're lucky, you might be able to spot one. They're very identifiable, as you can see. They don't look like a lot of our regular birds. So they're around the same size as a starling. They've got that real prominent crest that you can see there, and that black bandit mask. They get their name actually because they've got these red feathers in their wings, right on the tips. You can see just a flash of it there. And they get their name from those because they look like the red wax that seal letters. That's where they come from. You might spot some of these in even things like car parks. Can be quite an urban area that you see them. They tend to be looking for rowan berries. So keep an eye for it. If you see one of those in your bird watch, be very lucky. But it is possible. So hopefully you'll be able to spot some of these. And that sums up our kind of top 10 to 20, I think.
Thank you so much, Molly. That was absolutely brilliant. And I don't know, Molly, I don't know how long you've been in the wildlife team, but were you around when we had the Beast from the East winter and that brought all the filbert into Garden? I forget when that was. It was a few years ago.
Yes, I was.
So, because we were deluged, weren't we, with emails and phone calls saying, what is this bird? And filberts were just turning up everywhere. So that if you get a real cold snap, they will go into gardens, don't they? Won't they?
Yeah, definitely. Especially like the cold snap that we just had. It's got a bit more wet now, hasn't it? Unfortunately, but that cold snap we just had is just the perfect. Well, I saw one myself a week ago, so they are lovely. We got so many. You're right. We got so many inquiries. I used to start a phone call, and within 30 seconds of that call, I knew already what they were asking about. It was definitely going to be a field there.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's fascinating because Big Garden Birdwatch also allows us to kind of follow those trends, doesn't it? And we can chart by the huge amounts of data we have. We can chart how the songfisher has fallen down out of the top 10. We can chart how some of the smaller birds have risen. And because such a large number of people take part in Big Garden Birdwatch, that data is really, really valuable, and we can kind of match it to other stuff. So it shows us how birds are faring in our gardens, but we can kind of match it to other data that we're getting from other sites. Go, yeah, that's reflected here. Really, really interesting. Thank you so much, Molly. And any questions for Molly, please pop them in the Q&A for us now. I will just mention, while I remember, that for those of you who are watching the webinar today, we've got a special shop discount code. So if you want to get your bird feeders and bird food bought online on our RSPB shop, the code is WebPP, or capitals. We'll put that into the chat for you, and also the link for the shop. That gives you 20% off bird food and feeders. That's anything that's not already discounted, of course. That includes your postage and packaging, and there's no minimum spend. If you place your orders today, we will do our very best to get you those items by Big Garden Birdwatch. So yeah, the code and the link are there in the chat. That was absolutely brilliant, and we've had a few questions coming in. So if I can ask all our speakers to come back, Molly, Peter, and Ben. We've got a few. I'm just going to go back to Molly's first because Alan has asked what number was the waxwing. I don't know whether the events team we could get Lisa and Claire. We could get the waxwing back on the screen for a second. Purely because I want to see it as well, but we all want to see the waxwing. So just for Alan, if we could get that picture back on the screen. And while we're finding it, I would say waxwings are one of my absolute favourite birds, and I think the sound they make sounds like jingle bells at Christmas, like sleigh bells at Christmas. So I associate them with kind of the cold depths of winter. But also they have a few lovely other interesting behaviours. Now, when they come to courtship time, springtime, and I don't know if we get to see this much here, Molly, but they'll pass berries to each other. There's this lovely little courtship thing that they do. They also will eat insects. So once we've kind of got through winter, a few years ago, I think I mentioned this in our first session, we had an RSPB members event at the University of Nottingham. And there was a flock of waxwings on campus, about 20 waxwings, and they were quite high up in the trees. We got into sort of March time by then, so all the berries are gone, and we could watch the waxwings leaping up and just snatching insects from the air. So that was fascinating because they switch that diet like a lot of birds do. But yeah, beautiful birds. Molly, any other? I mean, you can't even mistake it for anything else, can you, Molly? It's quite obvious. But as you say, starling sized. And that sound is distinctive. Anything else about waxwings that you think would really stand out if you spot them across a supermarket car park?
See, I just think, just looking at them, there is just nothing else really that we have like them. We tend to say that they're quite fleeting. So if you'll see them and you'll probably have a cluster of them all feeding on a tree, and 20 minutes later they're gone. Which is why you're so lucky if you do manage to see them. Yeah, other than that crest really, and the black mast is quite striking. I think against their very buff, the rest of their feathers around their face are quite buff, so it's a very striking color difference. Although the wing bar might be similar to some of our other birds where we have wing bars like that, their face is just like nothing else that we've got.
Very true. And a classic kind of waxing behavior that I've seen before is you get a little flock of them, and they'll go down onto, I don't know, a rowan tree or something, and then feed, and then either they don't usually get disturbed by people. I'm going to talk to Ben about that in a minute, about how confiding these birds are. But perhaps a missel thrush will be defending its tree, because they do that in the winter. They'll drive them off, and the waxwings will fly up into a higher tree or into a roof, and they'll wait, and then they'll come down and they'll feast again, and then they'll fly up again. So it's always worth sticking around. Ben, where and how did you get this picture, and did you find them quite easy to approach?
Yeah, this one was just two birds in a nearby village to where I live, and they stayed all the way until March as well. But so this was March last year, where we had a strange like snowfall in March again. So we was lucky because they were feeding on these crab apples, and yeah, it just for 2 mornings in a row it snowed. So to get a chance of waxwings in the snow, this wasn't taken in Finland, it wasn't taken in Sweden, it was taken in Bedfordshire. But yeah, I've spent the last sort of month basically photographing waxwings almost constantly. And I have noted they are doing the berry passing behavior is happening now.
Oh,
so
brilliant.
you know that I think they maybe they hang around in pairs in the larger groups, or maybe they just kind of start bonding early, but they're already passing berries to each other now, which suggests that they're already sort of pairing up already. Even in this country, they're pairing up, ready to obviously nest in another country in, say, May or June.
That'd be a lovely photo, Ben. I don't know if you managed to get that so far, have you?
I have, yeah.
Oh, can't wait to see those. Can't
Yeah.
wait to see those. Peter, have you been lucky enough to see waxwings recently?
Not recently. Had some nice views. Funny, I was just reviewing my photographs this today for my own personal library, and realised I've seen quite a few over the years, and they're just so beautiful birds to photograph. And I've got them so many eating berries, but never passing to each other. But the one thing on identification which always gets me is that if you don't see the colour and you see a flock of them, they do look a bit like starlings until they actually land. You get the colour, and then you say, "Well, these aren't starlings; these are much more exotic." But the other lovely thing is that they do turn up in really surprising places. Yeah, supermarket car parks. Somebody's privet hedge is where I got my best photographs. And it's a promotion for wild privet, or just privet hedges, and let it flower and let it berry, because they love those black berries of privet.
That is interesting, because we often associate them with red berries. I've seen them eating rose hips, which was incredible, because it's massive chunky rose hips that are just swallowing whole. But they will work their way around, and I've heard it said that they like sometimes like kind of pink berries or like white berries, and sometimes red is not always the first choice. I've actually got another question for you, Peter, which is from Julian, who says, ask Peter about later involvement of Blue Peter when Big Garden Birdwatch went to 10 Downing Street. Can you tell us a bit about that?
I can guess which Julian that was. Yes, it was interesting that we were looking out for publicity, but publicity came to us, and because we were involved with the Big Garden Birdwatch in Blue Peter, we had access to a lot of children who fed the birds in the garden. They were a YOC group, and they came along every day. And then we had a suggestion that the John Major government might like a bird table in 10 Downing Street. And so the Blue Peter Bird Patrol, along initially with myself and then later with Julian Hughes, marched off to Downing Street, complete with our bag of bird food and a bird table, in through the front door, much to the surprise of the policemen. They don't see many bird tables going in and out through the front door, I don't think. And those children had a wonderful opportunity, and they were these young people from Shepherd's Bush who had a interesting inner city background. climbing up the stairs of Downing Street, sitting on the Chippendale chairs, and talking about birds. It was quite surreal. And later we had another visit in the Tony Blair government as well. That was more of a photo call. And then that government came to us saying, this thing goes on every year. We'd like a photograph, please, of the Prime Minister with the children. And we arranged that. So yeah, Blue Peter has been, and the Big Garden Birdwatch have been to some quite amazing places. It's grown and grown, and even National Audubon in the USA, they sent some education. So well, their educators were over here and wanted to discuss Big Garden Birdwatch because they were looking to revamping their big backyard birdwatch. So we've had ramifications elsewhere as well.
The media, I mean, it's always a delight when the British media pick up on it. And I remember one of my proudest moments in our PR team, when I worked in the PR team, was getting on the Archers. And the Archers did Big Garden Birdwatch. You know, who knows? EastEnders could be next one year. We've got a question from Chris, who says, over the years of Big Garden Birdwatch, which bird has gone down most in number and which has increased? I'm going to look to you, Peter, for that. I think, well, we've talked about song thrush. Would you say song thrush is the one that we've?
I think song thrush is the biggest one. I'm surprised
Yeah.
it's 20, and it may, I think the numbers are actually quite small there. That must be the standout go down. And the thing that worries me sometimes is we always talk about things going down, and there are a lot going down, even sparrows and starlings, even though they're still there at number 1 and number 2. There's nothing like the numbers there used to be. So they're all going down, really. But there are some new arrivals, and in 1979, we didn't expect long-tailed tits. We didn't even look for them, and I think I would actually have suspected they were pied wagtails or something. But long-tailed tits has come up, and of course goldfinch, and that's relatively recent. That was post the arrival. I think they were probably coming into some gardens where people were feeding Niger seed or specialist food, but they've now become a much more common garden bird. And that's nice. And it was nice this morning. I had a flock of long-tailed tits on the fat balls hanging in my garden, thinking, yeah, 40 years ago that wouldn't have happened. But they've discovered gardens are good places to go, and there's plenty of food, and we're feeding better quality food, and so they're coming in. Of course, we have got the pigeons growing in numbers as well, but people are always quick to tell me that and forget about the long-tailed tits and the goldfinches. So you have to balance these things out.
Yeah, so when we think about these kind of smaller birds, it's interesting to kind of predict what might happen, because the numbers that come into our garden now, I guess, for this year's Big Garden Birdwatch are going to be affected by temperatures and weather, but also those numbers will have also been affected by success in spring, won't they? About how the birds have done in breeding season.
Yeah, I think the mistake is often to take 1 year as a snapshot. Well, it is a snapshot, 1 year in isolation. You have to see it over the period of at least 5 and probably 10 years, and certainly over 40 years. And then you can see proper trends. And as you said earlier, the Big Garden Birdwatch isn't hugely scientific, but it's collecting real data, which is usable, and it compares very favorably with other data we're getting from other surveys and other times of the year. So it mirrors the starlings in winter, is also mirroring the starling breeding population, and similarly with house sparrows, which of course don't go very far. They're the same birds in winter as in spring. So yeah, there are these trends emerging, but people say, oh, it's been a good year, oh, it's been a bad year. Yes, it has, but watch it in relationship to this year and next year, and then you start to make a proper judgment about where bird populations are going.
Thanks, Peter. I must admit, I misread Alan's question from earlier about what number was the waxwing, so we've just been discussing it in the background. So I've just had a look at the results from last year, and as we predicted, it was quite low down in the Big Garden Birdwatch results. It was actually at number 77. So who knows? This year, chilly weekend, waxwing winter could be, could be in the top 50. What do we think? Be nice, wouldn't it? So I'm going to go over to Ben now, because Ben, I'm fascinated, and I'm absolutely obsessed with your pictures. One question that I know I've asked you before, and I just wanted to touch on it now, is that in a lot of the really nice images, the bird is on the side of the picture. That kind of rule of thirds that we often talk about in photography. What, is that still like a thing? Is it still a trend? Is it? I think it looks good. What do you think about it? Do you still use it a lot?
I think it's a bit of a my thing, I kind of you get into a habit of taking your own style of photos and editing your photos in a certain way. And I do when I'm taking the photo, I always sort of put my focusing point a little bit to the side so that there's some space, with the bird kind of looking into that negative space. I just like it. I like backgrounds as much as I like the actual bird themselves. Sometimes, like, I always think that's a lovely background. Even if the bird wasn't there, that would still make a lovely picture. So I do that. But obviously, in the world of like publishing, I think that was also a done thing. If you thought to yourself, oh, Lisa's going to put there's the berry passing photo.
Oh, beautiful. Oh, well
So yeah.
done.
Yeah, and to be honest with you, it's got that rule of thirds and slightly. It's still got some space to one side. So if this was a photo in a double page spread in a magazine, you've got some space in that top right hand corner to maybe write something, like the headline, something like Waxwing Love or something like that. So I think I always think a little bit along those lines as well about helping colleagues out with like magazine pictures and things like that. But I just like the negative space. I think it just helps the photo sort of breathe a little bit, I suppose. Yeah.
Thank you, Ben. And can we leave it on the screen? Because I love that. I just want to look at that for the rest of the day. That is the most stunning picture.
They did it a lot. They did it a lot.
So nice. I like the way the crest is up as well. A question from Jim, who says that do robins stay together all year? I'm going to come to you, Molly. I'm hoping you know the answer to this one. Do robins stay together all year? I assume they were solitary, but I have seen two together in my garden during the winter. Molly, robins.
It's quite unusual to have two together in the winter. So when they start to breed, the female will come into the male's territory and they share that area then. But once mating's done, the female goes off and she has her own area that she protects. That's why they both have a red breast. That's why they both sing all year round. They're very territorial. It depends when in the winter. If this is when you're saying winter, if it's the last few weeks, it could be very early courtship behavior. If it was earlier in the year, in the kind of colder weather, more like autumn, it could be a juvenile that's kind of hanging around with one of the parents. It's hard to know. But it is quite unusual to have two in the winter sharing the same spot because they are just so territorial.
Yeah, thank you, Jimmy. You may just have unusual robins, so enjoy them. Enjoy your two robins. I'm going to give everyone a chance for one last question to come through, and while I do that, I want to thank everybody. So thank you all for watching. Thank you all for being members because that makes such a huge difference to what we can do. And also thank you to Lisa and Claire from the events team who've worked really, really hard behind the scenes to make this event run smoothly. And thanks to Ben, Peter, and Molly, who have been superb today. I'm just going to mention very briefly a couple more sessions that we've got coming up. So on the first day of Big Garden Birdwatch, 26th of January, 12 noon, we will be doing Big Garden Birdwatch live on one of these free sessions. We'll be predicting again, looking at the weather as well, be a bit closer to the event, what might turn up in your gardens. We'll be discussing some of the conservation stories behind some of the birds. And we've got Sian Denny, who's in the same team as Molly Brown. She's from the wildlife team. She's going to be talking about garden bird health. So what can you do to keep your garden visitors safe and healthy? We're also going to be taking a sneaky peek at what might be in your garden if you were in one of our UK overseas territories. So we've got a lovely little video from our colleague Sasha from the Falkland Islands. I think he's stretching the point of what his garden actually is slightly, but I think you'll enjoy that. And then in the final session, which is on the 26th of January, we're going to be looking back over everyone's Big Garden Birdwatch, see what you've seen and what we can look forward to over the next year. We've got our wildlife garden expert, Adrian Thomas, coming in to tell you, well, give you some tips on what you can do to attract wildlife to your garden all year round. It's not just about bird food and feeders. It's about bushes and planting, all the other things you can do in your garden to get it set up for the year. So we've got no further questions. So in that case, thank you all very much for watching. And thanks again to our speakers and our wonderful events team. And we hopefully will see you all next time. Bye-bye.